The wind came low and dry across the plains, a sound like a frayed rope being pulled over stone. It worried the corners of the cabin, searching for a way in, and found none. Silas had made sure of it. His life was a fortress of small, deliberate actions against the intrusions of the world, a well-oiled hinge, a tightly chinked wall, a door bolted not by fear, but by a solemn reverence for quiet. The sun bleached the land to the color of bone, and the dust, fine as milled flour, hung in the air like breath held too long. He was scouring a cast-iron skillet on the porch steps, his knuckles raw, his movements rhythmic and scrubbed clean of thought. It was a ritual, same as splitting the morning wood or checking the far fence line where the world bled into an indifferent sky. He did not look up when the shadow first fell across the yard, a thing so small it was almost swallowed by the greater shadow of a lone, skeletal cartonwood. But the silence changed. It was no longer his own. He stopped scrubbing, the wet grit turning to paste on his hands. He looked up. A girl, no older than 7 or 8, stood at the edge of his hard-packed yard. Her dress was the color of a faded cornflower, patched at the elbow with a square of darker blue. Her hair was a wild tangle of sun-scorched straw, and her face was a mask of dust and dried tears, her eyes two enormous, dark pools of exhaustion. She held a bundle wrapped in a scrap of quilt, held it tight against her chest like a shield. He didn't speak. He waited. The wind was the only thing that moved between them. Finally, she took a single, shuffling step forward, then another. She stopped at the bottom of his porch steps, her gaze fixed on his worn boots. Her voice, when it came, was as small and dry as a seed pod rattling in the wind. Mama died in her sleep. She didn't look up. The words were offered to the dirt between them. "Can I spend a day with you, cowboy?" Silas set the skillet down. The sound was a dull, final thud on the wood. He wiped his hands on his trousers, a slow, methodical gesture that bought him a moment he did not know he needed. The girl did not flinch. She just stood there, a small, stubborn root that had found a crack in the stone of his solitude. He looked past her, to the unbroken line of the horizon from where she must have come. There was nothing. No wagon, no horse, no dust trail from a departing rider. Just the girl and the vast, aching emptiness that he knew so well. It was the same emptiness that lived inside the walls of his cabin, that sat across from him at his small table, that lay beside him in the cold bed. His first thought was a word, no. It was a word he had practiced, had perfected. It was the foundation of the quiet life he had built from the ruins of another. He was not a man for children. He was not a man for company. He was a man for whom the past was a more present companion than any living soul could be. He looked at her again, at the way her small hands gripped the bundled quilt, the knuckles white with strain. He saw the tremor in her chin she was trying so hard to control. He saw the grief, raw and new, a thing he recognized as one might recognize his own reflection in a dark window. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where she was from or how she had come to be here. The questions were heavy, and he had no room for more weight. He stood up, the joints in his knees cracking a protest. He turned and unlatched the door to the cabin, pushing it open into the dim, cool interior. He didn't look back at her. He simply held the door and waited. For a long moment, she remained frozen on the spot. Then, with a soft shuffle of worn leather soles on dirt, she climbed the 2 steps and slipped past him into the shadows of the house. He closed the door, and the sound of the latch clicking into place was different this time. It wasn't locking the world out. It was locking it in. The cabin was a single room, clean to the point of being sterile. A stone hearth, swept clean of ash, stood cold against one wall. A narrow cot was made with military precision. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center, their surfaces scrubbed bare. There was no clutter. No photograph, no stray book, no sign of a life lived with ease. The only evidence of a past was a closed door on the far wall, a door he never opened. The girl stood just inside, her small form silhouetted against the bright rectangle of the window. She watched him as he moved to the water bucket, his motions economical and sure. He ladled water into a tin cup and held it out to her. She took it with both hands, her fingers barely brushing his. She drank slowly, her throat working. He saw the clean lines the water made through the dust on her chin. When she was finished, she held the cup out and he took it. He broke a piece of bread from a loaf on the counter and gave it to her. She ate it in the same slow, serious way she had drunk the water. No word was spoken. The silence was thick with questions that neither of them would ask. He went about his chores, and she became his shadow. He oiled the leather of his saddle, and she sat on the floor nearby, tracing patterns in the dust with her finger. He split firewood out back, the rhythmic crack of the axe the only sound, and she watched from the doorway, her small face unreadable. She did not wander. She did not explore. She stayed within the small circle of his presence, as if he were a fire she needed for warmth. He was acutely aware of her, of the soft sound of her breathing, of the way her gaze followed him. It was an intrusion, a violation of the carefully constructed emptiness he called peace. Yet, it was not unwelcome. It was a disturbance, like a stone dropped into a still pond, and he found himself watching the ripples spread, a feeling akin to a painful, thawing curiosity. Night fell not as a blanket but as a slow tide of ink rising from the earth. The horizon softened, then dissolved. Silas lit a single lantern, and its glow pushed the shadows into the corners of the cabin, making the small space feel both intimate and vast. The question of the passing day hung in the air. A day she had asked for. The day was done. He prepared a meal of beans and salted pork, the smell filling the quiet room. He set 2 plates on the table, the second one an unfamiliar gesture. She sat in the chair opposite him, her feet not quite touching the floor. They ate in silence, the scrape of spoons against tin the only conversation. Her eyes, which had been downcast all day, occasionally flickered up to meet his before darting away again. He saw not fear in them, but a deep, watchful intelligence. She was learning him, the way a lost animal learns the sounds and smells of a new territory. When the meal was over, he took the plates. He did not tell her to go. He did not know how. The thought of sending her back out into that immense, dark wilderness was impossible. It felt like a betrayal of a promise he hadn't realized he'd made. He went to a wooden chest at the foot of his cot and pulled out a thick wool blanket and a canvas bedroll. He spread them on the floor near the hearth, the warmest part of the room. The blanket was old, its edges frayed, and it carried a faint, lingering scent of lavender and wood smoke, a ghost of a memory he tried to keep buried. He laid it down and smoothed it with his palm, his touch lingering for a second too long. He looked at the girl. "Here," he said. It was the first word he had spoken to her since letting her in. She went to the bedroll without hesitation, curled up on her side, and pulled the blanket to her chin. He banked the fire in the hearth, leaving just enough embers to fight the night's chill. He lay on his own cot, his back to her, and listened. He listened for the sound of weeping, but none came. He heard only the soft, even rhythm of her breathing, a small, living pulse in the profound silence of his house. It was a sound he had not heard in years, and it kept him awake long into the night, a sentinel guarding a fragile piece he hadn't known he'd lost. The morning light was pale and thin when the sound of a horse broke the stillness. It was a purposeful sound, not the slow amble of a stray. Silas was already awake. He stood from his cot and looked out the window. Sheriff Cole was dismounting, his form stark against the washed-out sky. His presence felt like a violation, a heavy hand on a fragile thing. Silas pulled on his boots and stepped outside, closing the cabin door softly behind him. He met the sheriff in the yard. Cole was a big man, his face weathered and etched with the certainty of his own authority. He nodded once, his eye sweeping over Silas before flicking to the cabin. "Heard you had company, Silas." It wasn't a question. Word travels. Silas's voice was flat, devoid of welcome. Cole's gaze was hard, judgmental. The whole town knew of Silas. They knew of the silence that had fallen over his homestead 3 years ago, of the wife and child buried on the rise behind the house. They saw his grief not as a private sorrow but as a public oddity, a thing to be whispered about. "A girl," Cole stated, his thumb hooked in his belt. They say she just walked up. Silas said nothing. He stood his ground, a wall of quiet refusal. Folks are concerned, the sheriff continued, his tone implying that folks and he were one and the same. A man like you. Alone out here. It ain't right, her being with you. From inside the cabin, there was a faint rustle. The door creaked open a few inches, and a small, wary face peeked out. Elara. She saw the sheriff's imposing figure and shrank back, her eyes wide. She moved to stand behind Silas, her small hand gripping the back of his worn trousers. The gesture was so small, so instinctive, but it sent a jolt through him. It was an act of claiming. Cole's eyes narrowed, taking in the scene. The reclusive, broken man and the lost child. It was a picture that fed every suspicion the town held. She needs to be with her people. Or with the church, Cole said, his voice taking on an official edge. She can't stay here. Silas looked down at the top of the girl's head, at the tangled straw-colored hair. He felt the trust in her grip. He looked back at the sheriff, his own gaze as unyielding as the hardpan earth beneath his feet. She's with me, he said, the words tasting strange and solid in his mouth. Cole spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. This ain't over, Silas. The town won't stand for it. He mounted his horse, gave one last, long look of disapproval, and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and unspoken threats hanging in the air. After the sheriff left, a new kind of quiet settled over the homestead. It was no longer just empty, it was defiant. They were a small island in a sea of disapproval. Silas went back to his work, his movements more deliberate than ever, as if to prove that nothing had changed. But everything had. The girl, Elara, stayed closer than before. She followed him to the small barn where he kept his single mare, watching as he forked hay into the manger. Her silence was not empty, it was absorbent. She was taking everything in. While he worked, her eyes fell upon a small workbench in the corner, covered in a thin layer of dust. On it sat a block of pine, half-carved. It was the shape of a bird, its head tilted, one wing beautifully rendered with delicate, feathered detail. The other wing was a rough, unfinished blank. He had started it for his daughter, before. After, he could not bring himself to touch it again. Elara reached out a tentative finger and traced the line of the finished wing, her touch feather-light. She didn't say anything, but Silas saw the gesture from the corner of his eye. It was a touch that acknowledged the unspoken history of the room. Later, back in the cabin, while Silas was outside mending a harness, she retrieved the small bundle she had arrived with. From it, she took a needle and a spool of black thread. She sat by the hearth, just as he had sat by his workbench, and began to mend the patch on her own dress. Her stitches were small and uneven, but they were determined. She worked with a focused gravity that mirrored his own. When Silas came back inside, the smell of rain on his clothes, he saw her. He saw the needle flashing in the lantern light, the look of intense concentration on her small face. He saw the small, imperfect repair she was making, an act of holding herself together. He stopped in the doorway and watched for a long moment. An unspoken understanding passed between them. They were both menders of broken things. He nodded once, a gesture so slight she might have missed it, and went to the hearth to build up the fire. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke that night. Rain lashed against the roof, and the wind howled around the corners of the cabin like a grieving animal. The world outside was a chaos of noise and water. Inside, the fire crackled, a small, defiant heart of warmth. Silas was oiling a rifle when a small sound cut through the storm's roar. It was a choked cry, quickly stifled. He looked over to the hearth. Elara was sitting bolt upright in her bedroll, her eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the thunder outside. She was trapped in a memory. He put the rifle down and crossed the room in 2 strides. He didn't touch her. He didn't speak. He simply knelt on the floor a few feet away, making himself a solid, steady presence in the turbulent dark. Her breathing was ragged, her small hands clenched into fists in the wool blanket. He waited. The storm in her slowly subsided, mirroring the one outside. The frantic fear in her eyes softened into a deep, liquid sorrow. When she could finally speak, her voice was a bare whisper, nearly lost in the sound of the rain. She was cold, she said, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. When I woke up, her hand was on my cheek, but it was so cold the fragmented memory hung in the air between them, a shard of glass. Silas felt the phantom chill of it himself. He knew that cold. He had held that same cold in his own hands. He finally broke his own silence, his voice rough but gentle. "The dark plays tricks," he said. It was more than he had said at once in years. It was an offering, a small piece of his own hard-won truth. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and in his worn, quiet face, she saw not a stranger, but an echo of her own pain. She didn't cry. She just nodded, a small, slow dip of her chin. The unspoken pact between them was sealed. He was the keeper of her sorrow, and she, somehow, was becoming the keeper of his. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The rain had passed, leaving behind the smell of damp earth and a sky of impossible blue. The calm was broken when Silas went to the old hand pump for water. He worked the handle, but only a wheezing gasp of air and a rusty trickle answered. The Wellpipe was blocked or broken. It was more than an inconvenience, it was a threat to their fragile existence. He spent the entire day on the task. He pulled up the long iron pipe, section by section, his muscles straining. It was heavy, awkward work for one man. He laid the pieces out in the yard, searching for the problem. Ilara watched from the porch, her chin resting on her knees. She saw his growing frustration as the sun climbed high, beating down on his back. His movements, usually so calm and efficient, became sharper, edged with anger. He swore under his breath when a rusted bolt refused to turn. He was fighting more than a broken pump, he was fighting the relentless tendency of things to fall apart. In the afternoon, as he struggled to align two heavy sections of pipe, Ilara slid off the porch. She walked over to him, her bare feet silent in the damp dirt. She didn't say a word. She just picked up the heavy wrench that had slipped from his grasp and held it out to him. He stared at her for a moment, surprised. Then he nodded and took it. From that moment on, she was his partner. She passed him tools. She held a bolt steady while he tightened the nut. She wiped grease from his hands with a rag when he asked for it. Her presence was a quiet counterpoint to his frustration. As dusk began to settle, he gave the handle one final, desperate pump. There was a gurgle, a cough, and then a gush of clean, clear water spilled into the bucket. Silas straightened up, wiping sweat and grime from his forehead with the back of his arm. He looked at the flowing water, then at the girl. A small, rare smile touched the corner of his mouth. She smiled back, a real smile that lit up her dusty face. They had not just fixed a pump. They had built something together, a small victory against the entropy of the world. 2 days later, Sheriff Cole returned. He was not alone. Beside him on a placid mare sat a woman in a severe black dress, her hair pulled into a tight bun that seemed to pull her face taut with judgment. She was Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, a woman whose piety was a weapon she wielded with quiet pride. They rode into the yard like a verdict. Silas saw them coming and his body went still. He felt Ilara, who had been drawing in the dirt with a stick, press herself against his leg, her small body rigid. "Silas," Cole said, his voice holding a note of finality. "We've come for the girl. Mrs. Gable will see she's taken care of properly. The church has a place for orphans." And Mrs. Gable dismounted, her movement stiff. She approached Ilara with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Come now, dear child," she said, her voice cloyingly sweet. "You'll be safe with us. We'll find you a good, Christian home." Ilara did not look at her. She tightened her grip on Silas's trousers, burying her face against his leg. Her defiance was absolute, a silent scream of refusal. Silas put a hand on her head, a gesture that was both protective and proprietary. He looked at Cole, then at the woman. He saw their world, a world of rules and proprieties and neatly filed sorrows. It was a world that had no place for a bond forged in silence and shared grief. He thought of the long, quiet days, the shared meals, the mended pump. He thought of the half-finished bird on his workbench. He had been a man hollowed out by loss, living in a shell. This small, silent girl had walked into the emptiness and, without trying, had begun to fill it. The thought of this place returning to its crushing silence was more than he could bear. He had lost one family to the caprice of fate. He would not lose this one to the judgment of others. He felt a resolve harden in his chest, solid and heavy as iron. He looked down at the top of Ilara's head, at the fierce, trembling loyalty in her small frame. The choice was not a choice at all. It was an inevitability, like a river finding its way to the sea. He raised his eyes to meet the sheriff's. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but carried the weight of an oath. "She stays," Mrs. Gable gasped, a small, offended sound. "That is not your decision to make, sir. She is a child in need of moral guidance and a woman's care. She has care," Silas said, his gaze unwavering. Sheriff Cole shifted in his saddle, uneasy. He was a man of law, but he was also a man who understood the look in another man's eyes. He saw something in Silas he hadn't seen before, not the haunted grief of a hermit, but the unyielding purpose of a protector. "Silas, be reasonable," Cole tried, his tone softening slightly. "What can you offer her out here?" "This is no life for a child." Silas didn't answer the question directly. He didn't need to list the things he could offer. They were not things the sheriff or the preacher's wife could understand. He could offer silence that was safe, work that was honest, and a grief that was shared, not hidden. He could offer the unspoken promise that she would never wake up to find him gone. "She stays," he repeated, the words like stones dropped one by one. There was nothing more to say. Cole held his gaze for a long moment, then sighed, a sound of weary defeat. He looked at Mrs. Gable, whose face was a mask of righteous indignation, and shook his head slightly. They were beaten, not by argument, but by a bond they could neither measure nor break. Without another word, they turned their horses and rode away, their rigid backs a testament to their failure. The dust settled behind them. Silas stood for a long time, his hand still on Ilara's head. The vast, empty land did not seem so empty anymore. That evening, as firelight warmed the cabin, Silas picked up the half-carved bird from his workbench. He took out his sharpest knife and, with slow, patient strokes, began to carve the second wing. Ilara sat by the hearth, watching, the wooden figure slowly becoming whole in his hands. When it was finished, he sanded it smooth and handed it to her. She took the bird, its two wings now perfectly matched, and held it cupped in her hands as if it were a living thing. She looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. Her voice was small, a test of the fragile new world they inhabited. "For a day," she whispered. Silas looked at her, at the child who had walked out of the wilderness and into the empty landscape of his heart. The lines of grief on his face were still there, but they were softened now by a different light. He gave her the truest thing he had left to give. "You can stay forever."